Okay. Um, People on the Zoom end, have, do I disappear when this happens? No, I'm asking people in here. I don't know if, yes, I disappear when it happens. Then I come back. All right. Uh, I'm not sure what to do except to hope it doesn't keep happening. Um, Seems like it will though. All right. It's possible this lecture might have to go to in-person only. Um, right. We'll see what happens because I can't keep doing this, obviously. Um, all right. So Spinoza discusses four traditional answers to question number one. The first one is that we interpret the Bible using a supernatural faculty. This is basically the Protestant answer. Right? To interpret the Bible correctly, you need faith. Here understood as some kind of supernatural grace. Right? Not like what Locke means by faith. It'd be like you have to believe the person who told it to you or something. It's something supernatural. Um, the second answer is tradition. And this is basically the Jewish answer. Right? We have a chain of transmission from like, yes. Third, responses to the first and second. These are responses to the first question. Right? How can we tell what the Bible means? How do we interpret the Bible? Right? The first answer is the only way to interpret the Bible correctly is using faith, which is a supernatural gift given by God. The second answer is to interpret the Bible correctly. The Bible was originally given with an interpretation, basically. And you have to have a chain of transmission from that original interpretation. Yeah, maybe to some extent. But I mean, it's definitely Maimonides who really pushes this and says that explicitly. So it's like that's a good address for it. Right, the example from Maimonides might be a little bit difficult to understand, especially because R.H.M. Ellis, the translator, chose to translate Maimonides into. Now, I mean, there's already a problem here, which I think Maimonides and Spinoza are both fully aware of, but neither of them are going to let on. That the Bible doesn't really clearly say that the world was created ex nihilo in time. On the contrary, it seems to say that there was something else there. Right? It talks about God's spirit hovering over the waters and whatever, right? So, and I think I've said this before, it's not really clear to me where the doctrine of creation and time came from. It doesn't come directly from biblical sources. It doesn't come from philosophical sources, unless from a certain kind of Platonism, possibly. But at this point, it's considered, and Maimonides and Spinoza are playing along with this, that as if the Bible literally says the world was created ex nihilo. Right. So Maimonides is saying, nevertheless, that's not why I say the world was created in time. For the texts which teach that the world was created are not more in number than those which teach that God hath a body. Neither are the approaches in this matter of the world's creation closed or even made hard to us, so that we should not be able to explain what is written, as we did when we showed that God hath no body. Right? So Maimonides is saying there's plenty of texts in the Bible that make it sound like God has a body. or at least is located in space. I mean, first of all, there's texts that talk about his arm and his nose and various other things, right? But moreover, it says, the Lord came down on Mount Sinai in a cloud of fire and whatever, right? So that means he was up there and he came down. So Maimonides says, of course, we know God doesn't really have a body. Although, as I said, there were other people in the Middle Ages who accused Maimonides of heresy because obviously, according to the Bible, God has a body. That was a distinct minority, though. Anyway, so Maimonides says, like, of course we know God doesn't have a body. What do we do with these biblical texts? Well, we reinterpret them as I've shown you previously. And this book, Moreh Nevuchim, is like this book, is largely devoted to biblical interpretation, although it's only the Old Testament, obviously. With a lot of discussion of Hebrew words and what different meanings they can have or whatever, even though it's written in Arabic. So, right. So he says, look, I mean, we had no trouble reconciling those texts that imply or say that God has a body with the philosophical doctrine that God doesn't have a body. And he says, yet two things hinder me from doing as I have said and believing that the world is eternal. As it hath been clearly shown that God hath not a body, we must perforce explain all those passages whereof the literal sense agreeth not with the demonstration, for sure it is that they can be so explained, right? And this is where he's giving away, like saying explicitly what his methodology is, right? Because he says, like, those passages definitely can be explained some other way. Because we have a demonstration that is a philosophical demonstration that God doesn't have a body. And the Bible can't disagree with a philosophical demonstration. I mean, then it would be false. So it has to be reinterpreted. Right? But then he says, but the eternity of the world hath not been so demonstrated. This is the second problem. So Maimonides interprets Aristotle to mean that it's probable that the world is eternal in prior time, but it doesn't have a demonstration of it. This is a very weird interpretation of Aristotle. And moreover, Maimonides announces it. He says, and I'm going to tell you something great that you've never heard before about Aristotle. So like he's very conscious that he's interpreting Aristotle and announcing his new radical interpretation of Aristotle to him. But then here he says, well, since there is no demonstration that the world has always existed, right? The eternity of the world hath not been so demonstrated. Therefore, it is not necessary to do violence to Scripture in support of some common opinion, whereof we might, at the bidding of reason, embrace the contrary. So what's really going on there in Maimonides? As I said, Maimonides is at least as tricky an author as Spinoza. What's really going on there? Who knows? Right? I mean, he's well aware that he's not just interpreting the Bible, but also interpreting Aristotle, and that in this case, it kind of looks like he stretched the interpretation of Aristotle to fit what the Bible means. Only, of course, it's not what the Bible actually means, but what it's supposed to mean. So yeah, it's really complicated. By the way, there were also medieval Jewish writers who, and even like philosophical writers who proved the eternity of matter from the beginning of Genesis. So not everyone goes along with this. But in any case, so that's the quote from Maimonides. So Spinoza says, so you can see what his method is. He follows philosophy. If you want to know what a biblical verse means, check with philosophy what's true, and then it will tell you, how you have to interpret the verse. Now you notice that all four of these, I mean, I guess it is confusing the way I wrote it here, isn't it? all four, these are answers to problem one. However, all four of them provide an automatic answer to problem two, right? Like if we're interpreting the Bible using a supernatural faculty given by God, then presumably what we find is going to be true, right? Like God's not going to give us a supernatural faculty to get falsehoods out of the Bible. Well, I don't know. Maybe some of them claim it, but most people don't claim it. And certainly in the wake of Descartes, we're not going to claim it, right? So, this one also, right? Like if our claim to interpretation is that we have this tradition that goes back to the miraculous revelation of the Bible, which went along with this further oral revelation to Moses. That's the way it's understood. So obviously that means that both of them are true, right? They were given this miraculous event, whatever. This one also, right? Like if the Pope is divinely authorized to interpret the Bible, well, presumably that means the Pope says the Bible means it's going to be true. And finally, this one, right, is this is based on an external check on what's true, and it's supposed to be one that gives certainty. So the interpretations we get to this way are going to be true. So Spinoza rejects all four of these. Yeah.
No question for me with the Jewish tradition.
Yeah.
Is it oral and written or just oral?
Well, I mean, the written is, I think Spinoza actually talks about this in this book too, like how certain are we that the text has reached us intact. And by the way, so like Muslims said, Maimonides definitely worried about this. I don't know if Spinoza cares about this. But like Muslims said, or I mean, still say, I guess, that, that God gave a certain book to Moses, but they say that the book that we have has been corrupted. It's not the original book. So, yeah, so I mean, I guess in some sense it involves both of those, right? Like you have to trust the tradition of scribal copying. But here he's not focusing on that issue. He's assuming we have the text of the Bible, even though, again, as I say, elsewhere in this book, he raises all kinds of questions about that. But he's assuming we have the text of the Bible, which we want to know how to explain it. And so, and then oftentimes the explanations are weird. Like they don't seem to match what you would think is the literal meaning. I mean, like probably the most famous one is when the Bible says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, right? Where in the context of damages, where the idea seems to be that if I cut off someone's hand, you should cut off my hand and so forth. So the rabbis say, this means monetary damages. Means the value of a hand. Right, but I mean, that's just one example out of literal millions probably. Right, so I mean, so, just as this one is going to give a very distinctive results. Right, but Spinoza rejects all of these. So like for the first one, he says, this is on page 114. First of all, he says, let them be placed side by side. He's talking about the interpretations that were supposedly written with this faculty, supernatural faculty. He says, let them be placed side by side with the interpretations of those who frankly confess that they have no faculty beyond their natural ones. We shall see that the two are just alike, both human, both long pondered over, both laboriously invented. Right? In other words, when you look at these interpretations, you don't see any sign of a supernatural faculty at work. Right? Moreover, he says, and now, I mean, this is something that his opponents may not agree with. So this is, he's assuming you're going to agree with him, I think. I mean, you kind of have to know how to interpret the Bible first before you can say this. Maybe. But he says, look, like the prophets and the apostles didn't preach only to the faithful. In fact, they preached mostly to sinners. people who don't have this supernatural fact. Therefore, according to you, couldn't understand what they were saying. That's pointless. So for both of those reasons, he says, this is ruled out. What about this one? Well, he says, I mean, like to begin with, who knows if this tradition really is accurate? Like, what basis do we have for thinking it's that this tradition is like flawless? More than that, he says we have reasons to think there's something very wrong with it. Because, so, I mean, this is maybe not as strong as it might sound, but you know, there are places. There's one place in particular. I think there's more than one, but I think I know which one he has in mind. There are places where there's like a list of the generations through which the tradition was handed down. That's in rabbinic texts, like in the Mishnah. And Spinoza points out that it's missing some centuries. It like telescopes the whole Persian period. And it's just, you know, we know from all kinds of external sources what that chronology is there, right? I mean, like we have Persian sources that tell us what the you know, succession of Persian kings was and how long it lasted before Alexander the Great and so forth, right? So he says, like, I mean, the reason I say it's not quite as strong as you might think is that like rabbinic texts are not really organized, right? It's not like this goes at the beginning and everything else refers back to it. It's just like a random fragment. Someone said, here's a list of generations. But still, I mean, it's a pretty good indication that this is like not rock solid here. If somewhere there's a list, these are the people who transmitted and it's missing a few hundred years. The list couldn't be right. Yeah. So he says, no. I mean, by the way, I think like if you think about Spinoza from our book, Spinoza has all kinds of other reasons for thinking these would work probably. But he's focusing on a pretty simple level to rule them out there. This one, it's kind of a combination of these two. He says, like, on the one hand, like this one, how can we be sure that they've got the right authorized interpreter? After all, during the Middle Ages, there were a lot of anti-popes and right, there was like a lot of controversy about who is the Pope and who isn't. And if you get the Pope wrong once, then all the popes after that, and you know, I mean, right. So that's one problem. Another problem is, well, actually, no, it's not a combination of this one and this one. It has one problem with this one. Another problem is, and this is actually really interesting, Spinoza says, we don't expect an authorized interpreter. He says, when do you need an authorized interpreter? Now, I mean, this is partly to head off an argument that someone might make. They would say, based on certain biblical texts, look, in the times of the temple, the high priest was authorized to interpret the law. So shouldn't we think that now too, we should have a high priest who's authorized to interpret the law? And who is that? That's the Pope. But Spinoza says there's a big difference between the Mosaic law in the time of the temple and the Christian interpretation of the Bible now. Namely, he says the Mosaic law, was the civil law of a certain commune. And of course, you need an authorized interpreter. They don't even have to tell the truth, right? So this would break, I think, right? But we need one interpretation. Otherwise, the whole legal system will fall apart, right? So like, just like we have a Supreme Court, and there's no appeal beyond that, even if you think they're wrong. He says a legal system needs that, but he says religion now is just about personal morality. So everyone everyone has to interpret it for themselves. An authorized interpreter makes no sense. Okay, so for both of those reasons, this is ruled out. For this is what I'm going to say. What I was going to say, it has something in common with this one, right? Namely, that like this means only philosophers would be able to understand the Bible. So like those prophets and apostles who went out and preached to everyone they could find, that was pointless. Those people couldn't understand them because they hadn't all studied philosophy. He doesn't mention that philosophers also don't agree with each other, but of course he knows that too, but he's not mentioned. And Maimonides knows that too, right? Remember, I just said, he says, no, Aristotle doesn't mean what you think. Aristotle means this. And moreover, he says this would be politically bad because it would turn philosophers into a kind of ruling elite. And he says, this would be a new ruling class more likely to be subject to ridicule than rebellion or something. I forget how he puts it, right? I mean, that's interesting. Obviously, that's kind of allusion to Plato's Republic, where when Socrates says that philosophers should rule and expects ridicule. What does that mean in terms of whether Spinoza really thinks philosophers should rule or what? But moreover, in addition to both of those, those are kind of two sides of the same thing. But in addition to those, he says, look, this is just no way to interpret a text. You don't decide that it's true first and then figure out how to interpret it. First, you have to understand what it means. And then you can decide if it's true. And this is what he means when he says that scripture can only be interpreted through itself, right? I mean, that sounds like a very Protestant thing to say, sola scriptura, right? We only have scripture as our authority. But what he means is the scripture is not an authority. The only authority here is reason. Maimonides is right about that. What he's wrong about is that we can expect the Bible to conform to it. Right? So in contrast with that passage from Maimonides, where he talks about how to interpret, if the Bible says God has a body, how you have to reinterpret it, is Spinoza's own discussion of the example. Starts at the very bottom of page 101. Where he said, it's right after saying that scripture has to be interpreted. Well, actually, it's after talking about which passages have been called obscure. And he says a passage is obscure if it's not consistent with general principles of scripture or something like that, not if it's inconsistent with our reason. I will illustrate my meaning by an example. The words of Moses, God is a fire and God is jealous, are perfectly clear so long as we regard merely the signification of the words. And I therefore reckon them among the clear passages, though in relation to reason and truth, they are most obscure, right? So, at one place he calls it Moses, but in another chapter, he proves that Moses is not the author of the 5 books of Moses. But okay, here he says Moses, right? So in one place it says that, the Lord your God is a consuming fire. And another place, probably more than one place, it says the Lord your God is a jealous God, or. So he says, actually, I misrepresented him. He says both of these are clear, even though they're clearly inconsistent with reason. We know just what they mean. So now he says, so should they both be interpreted literally? And here the question is, what should we think the author means? The human author. And his answer is, in the present instance, as Moses says in several other passages, that God has no likeness to any visible thing. Now, I mean, this is weird because elsewhere in this book, he actually casts a lot of doubt on that's what these passages imply. But here he's taking for granted. I mean, I keep saying things like that because that's what this book is like, right? Like here he's taking for granted this. But if you look somewhere else, you'll see he doesn't really take that for granted. That's what this whole book is like. Very different from the ethics. Right, anyway, so he's taking for granted that when it says you shall make no image of God, it means because God doesn't have an image. Right. So in the present instance, as Moses says in several other passages, that God has no likeness to any visible thing, either all such passages must be taken metaphorically, or else the one before us must be so explained. Right. So he's saying, like, reason, it doesn't matter what reason tells us. Moses says in lots of other places that God doesn't have a body. So, we shouldn't interpret him as literally meaning that God is a fire. But on the other hand, he goes on to say that in the case of God is jealous, Moses clearly teaches that God is jealous everywhere he talks about this. He never says the opposite. So we have to assume that Moses thinks God is jealous, even though that's also repugnant to reason. Um, so again, that's the correction to Maimonides' method. He agrees that philosophy, although his philosophy, not Maimonides, maybe, but anyway, he agrees that philosophy is the standard of truth, but he disagrees that it can be used to interpret the Bible because he doesn't think the Bible is true. Right. Um, okay, so instead of this, Spinoza's official answer, at least, how should you interpret the Bible? And I think I said this before, it's basically all the methods of modern biblical criticism, right? Like being set out essentially for the first time. You have to study the history of the text. You have to, ask how it was transmitted to us. You have to ask whether the whole text was written by one author or whether it contains various pieces. And he already says something very similar to what later biblical critics say. But for example, the 5 books of Moses were compiled by Ezra, but he used earlier sources and he put them together without trying to reconcile them with each other very well. And that's why you often get 2 versions of the same story, one after another, that don't agree with each other and so forth. Right. So that's how he says we should really interpret the Bible. He says, like, first of all, unfortunately, because the people in between didn't bother to save all the like archival sources and whatever that we could have used to do this properly, it's very hard to do. And we have to be left very uncertain in many cases what the Bible means. But he says it doesn't matter because the the Mosaic law is no longer in effect since the Jewish Commonwealth was destroyed. But, right, that's the civil law code of some state that no longer exists. So it's irrelevant. But beyond that, he says what the core of what the Bible contains is ethical precepts. And the other things it says about history and miracles and whatever are really not important. And every author wrote down whatever they thought about those things, and we don't, it's hard to tell what they thought sometimes, but it doesn't really matter because they all agreed on these ethical precepts. So, as I mentioned before, this is worrying. So if you look either, and as I said, these readings are not really matched up with the ethics readings, but the end of this reading has in common with the end of this ethics reading that there's kind of a list of the great, broadly speaking, ethical consequences of Spinoza's view. Um, so, um, um, right? And the end of this chapter is, um, therefore, as the supreme right of free thinking, even on religion, is in every man's power, as it is inconceivable that such power could be alienated, it is also in every man's power to wield the supreme right and authority of free judgment in this behalf and to explain and interpret religion for himself. And that's like the overall point of this book, is to show that, basically, that there should be freedom, at least. I mean, he's it's not clear, at least to me, exactly what he thinks about freedom to practice religion in the terms of like doing rituals or whatever. But in terms of expressing religious or philosophical opinions, for that matter, he says, his whole point is to argue that um, the, a state should allow absolute freedom with that respect, that right is not alienable, and that's what the Bible says. Did you have a question?
In what I don't know how to sense it. It almost sounds like he's sort of, and not exactly, but it's almost as though he's saying that
But it's natural, it's not supernatural. Yeah, everyone has a natural faculty. But I mean, it's it doesn't mean everyone is an equally good interpreter, an equally good critical scholarly interpreter of ancient texts. He certainly doesn't think that. Quite on the contrary, he thinks most people are totally incompetent. But he means everyone has the ability to get the ethical truth out of this text or some other text. And again, elsewhere in this book, he proves that other nations, again, he proves that this is consistent with the Bible, that other nations also had their prophets. Um, um, and moreover, what ends up being meant by a prophet in the end is, as I think, as I pointed out the first time I talked about the theological political treatise, that how do you know someone is a true prophet? Not because they do miracles. Because, first of all, according to Spinoza, miracles, strictly speaking, are impossible. Like he says that clearly in here, not just in the ethics. Miracles, strictly speaking, are impossible. There can't be any violation of the eternal laws of nature. What we mean by a miracle is an extraordinary event that was adapted to the mind of the observer. So, in other words, something happened. And most of the time, he talks as if he thinks exactly what it says in the Bible really happened, but there's plenty of cases, points where he lets show that, yeah, probably it wasn't really that. But I mean, let's say that you're trying to cross the sea and there's people chasing you, and all of a sudden there's an extraordinary wind that blows the sea apart. right? Like, to you, that seems like it was done for your sake. And that's what you call a miracle. But actually, that was just a natural event. How do we know that? Because again, we can prove that there are no violations of the laws of nature. So if the sea really did split, it must have had a natural cause. I think Spinoza really thinks that, yeah, maybe something happened. It's been exaggerated. I mean, you know, again, he's like, I don't know, picking his battles. So, uh, right, so we can't identify someone as a prophet because they do miracles. How do we know if they're a prophet? And here again, he's agreeing with Maimonides. We know they're a prophet because their teaching involves the correct moral, political doctrine. Um, so, um, so how does he really think you should interpret the Bible or Aristotle for that matter? That's, I mean, yes, I guess, well, yeah, maybe I should discuss these two things together because, like I said, I feel like I didn't read the right thing from this reading either. I think there was another place where he was clearer that he was drawing ethical conclusions from it. But so at the end of part 2, there's this, right? He says, my final task on page 100, my final task is to show what practical advantages accrue from the knowledge of this doctrine. And the first 2 are about like our attitude. They're kind of stoic like, and also kind of Descartes like. It teaches us that we act only by God's will. It teaches us what attitude we should adopt regarding fortune, right? I mean, those are ethical doctrines, basically. But as I said, in a broad sense, not about do this and do that, but about like what attitude you should take towards fate and fortune and so forth. But then the next one, he says, this doctrine assists us in our social relations in that it teaches us to hate no one, despise no one, ridicule no one, be angry with no one, envy no one. Then again, it teaches us that each should be content with what he has and should help his neighbor, not from womanish pity or favor or superstition, but solely from the guidance of reason as occasion and circumstance require. This I shall demonstrate in part 4. So that's also a little weird. I mean, so first of all, that you should be angry with no one is a position that Maimonides takes explicitly against Aristotle. Right? Maimonides in general is a very circulative human, and it's subject to his interpretation of Aristotle. Right? Um, but when it comes to the virtues, so Aristotle says about anger the same thing he says about everything else, that the virtue is a mean between extremes. So you shouldn't be too angry or not angry enough. And Maimonides says that this is not true. You shouldn't be angry at all. I mean, he gives a rabbinic source, which apparently he had and we don't, because there's no existing rabbinic source that says this. But he gives a rabbinic source. It says that whoever is angry, it's as if he worshipped idols. But I think he's being Platonist probably when he says that. He probably didn't have Plato in Arabic, but he's getting it from some Platonist, right? I mean, like Socrates never gets angry. Also, arguably doesn't despise or ridicule anyone. I mean, it depends like a lot of things in the Platonic dialogues depend on the stage directions that aren't there. right? Like what tone of voice does Socrates say something in? Is he teasing or is he like, scolding or is he, yeah, I mean, um, anyway, the thing that's weird about this though is that these are not traits I associate with Spinoza. Not to despise anyone, not to ridicule anyone, not to be angry at anyone. Well, maybe it's hard to tell if he's angry. Certainly sounds like he's despising and ridiculing a lot of people. I mean, we'll see coming up in Leibniz, a famous quote from Leibniz where he says that after having considered many things, he despises nothing. Right. And that definitely describes, that does match the way Leibniz deals with his predecessors. But Spinoza, one possibility is, Maimonides says sometimes you have to activate for other people's good, but don't let yourself actually be angry. This is pretty difficult, I think. But that's his advice, right? So that like Moses, who must have been the most virtuous of all people because he was the greatest prophet and lawgiver and whatever, seems to get really angry at some point. Maimonides explains he wasn't really angry, he was acting. So maybe we're supposed to understand that Spinoza doesn't really despise and ridicule these people, that he's just talking that way for our good. I don't know. Anyway, there's a whole connected problem with like, um, what is the connection between various pieces and Spinoza's ethical doctrine that he wants to recommend? And why does he want to recommend it and to whom? And does it match him personally or not? And so forth. And that's all I'm going to say about it for now. I guess I might say a little bit about it next time because we're going to be reading the actual ethical parts of the ethics. Are there questions about any of that before I go on? Okay. I guess there were some questions while I was talking, so that's okay. All right. So now for something completely different, or mostly different. Um, So the theme from the ethics reading, the second part of book 2 is basically the problem of evil, I mean, in particular with respect to error. That is the problem that Descartes first discusses in the 4th meditation and then finishes up in the 5th and 6th meditation. This part definitely contains something matching the 4th meditation and the 6th meditation. I'm not agreeing with, but matching with it. I'm not sure what's supposed to match the 5th meditation. But even Descartes, that was the one where it was hardest to understand the explanation of error. Okay, anyway, so but to understand what's going on here, I mean, it's probably actually best to start with the argument that the meditator makes in the 3rd meditation. So, right, at some point in the proof of the existence of God, which basically works like this: I'm not God, therefore I can't have caused myself to exist. Therefore, something else must have caused me to exist. But if that thing's not God, infinite regress, therefore God exists, right? Something that's roughly speaking the structure of it. And at some point, the meditator stops and says, but perhaps I am something greater than I myself understand. And goes on to explain what that means, that I don't have all these perfections actually, but that I have them potentially, and I'm getting more and more as time goes on. And eventually I'll be infinitely perfect. So in other words, maybe I am God. I just don't know it yet. Is that what the meditator is considering? And, the response to that in the meditations is that the idea of God contains absolutely nothing that is potential, right? In other words, being still only potentially something is itself an imperfection. It's inconsistent with the idea of an infinitely perfect substance. And also, we have to go back to see how these two responses relate to each other. But also, he says, or she says, the meditator, if that's Francine, if I derived existence for myself, I would have given myself every perfection of which I have the idea. Which is like a way of saying basically God wouldn't deceive himself. Right? That is, if we want to say the reason I have all these errors is because even though I actually am infinitely possible, I haven't given myself all the perfections yet. That would be saying like God deceived himself. God didn't give himself some of the perfections that he was capable of giving to himself, in particular, the perfections that rule out error. I mean, in the meditations, we're only talking about error at that point because in the meditations, the only possibility of using the will that we know exists is using the will for affirming and denying. Here it's more complicated. We are going to go on to discuss more like standard ethics issues about the passions and so forth. But still in this part, it's like we're focusing first of all on the case where the will has this clear relation to the intellect. And according to Spinoza, the relation is going to turn out to be identity, right? That's the surprise near the end. But so again, we're talking about the will as affirming or denying the content of an idea. And therefore, the imperfections we're talking about are errors. So the meditations proof says, I couldn't be God because there's things I don't know. And if I were God, I wouldn't have deceived myself this way. That itself would be an imperfection. So in a nutshell, Spinoza's explanation of error is that, first of all, with respect to substance, I am God, right? There's only one substance. So if you ask, so to speak, like remember I said that the secondary substances, the substantial predicates of an individual like Socrates are basically answers to the question, what is this? This is a human, this is an animal. So according to Spinoza, like there's a sense in which whenever you see any finite thing, if you ask, what is this? The answer is God. That's the only thing here. In the strong sense where thing means substance. So I am something greater than I myself understand. Right? Like when the meditator said that, the meditator was getting close to the truth. I am something greater than I understand, something infinitely greater than I understand. And therefore, with respect to substance, I do derive my existence from myself, right? I'm self-caused, causa sui. I do give myself all possible perfections, even the ones we might have thought were inconsistent with each other. And there's quote unquote nothing potential in me, right? There's nothing potential in God because being merely potential and not actual is like, I mean, those descriptions make sense from our point of view within time, right? Like we say, this flower is potentially a fruit, but it's not actually a fruit yet. But from God's eternal point of view, the flower and the fruit both follow by the same necessity, the divine essence. So they're both actual. They're not, there's nothing potential. Um, um, and Spinoza, like at some point here, says he talks about the intellect in act, right? That's as opposed to the intellect in potentia. The actual or intellect as opposed to the potential intellect. And he says, like, kind of parenthetically, by the way, I'm talking here as if I make a distinction between potential and actual intellect, although I really don't. That is, he's going to prove that there's, right, that everything in God's intellect is actual. And God's intellect is all the intellect there is. Right? Other, quote unquote, other intellects are fragments of it, finite modes of it. So, and it's because this is the clever thing here. Because as substance, I give myself all the perfections. So here's the infinite mode of intellect and the attribute of thought, this divine essence. Right? This is the attribute of thought, and this is the infinite mode of intellect within the attribute of thought. So I have to give myself all possible perfections. Well, that means I have to give myself not just infinite modes, but also all the possible finite modes. Like, for example, oops. This is the attribute of extension. The idea of this bond. This is a human body, then this idea is a human mind, or human, strictly speaking, right? So, this body can't exist on its own, right? It can't be conceived, it can't exist through itself or be conceived through itself. And not only because it has to exist and be conceived based on God, but also because it can't exist or be conceived without some other bodies that are its cause. So in order for God not to deceive himself, this idea has to have the same characteristics as this body. Otherwise, God would be deceived, right? That is, otherwise the divine intellect would contain an inaccurate idea of this body. So, since this body, so to speak, isn't well defined without all these other bodies, similarly, the idea must not be well defined without other ideas that are not in it. And so, qua finite mode, I have to be deceived precisely because God can't deceive himself. As I said, that's the clever thing here. Right? It's not like two separate things that are balanced off against each other or something. It's just the same thing from two different points of view. Um, um, so, like, I mean, roughly speaking, this is similar to some of the answers that Descartes gave in the Fourth Meditation. Not the final answer, where he says that the will is like extends farther than the intellect, because Spinoza is going to disagree with that, right? Spinoza says the will and the intellect are identical. Every idea involves the affirmation that its object exists. But some of those other answers that Descartes, had had to go on from because they didn't see his purposes, right? So like one is that what looks to me like what from my point of view is privation is from God's point of view mere negation. Spinoza actually uses different terminology here. So where Descartes says negation, Spinoza says absolute privation. And although I don't think this phrase occurs anywhere, that implies that where Descartes says privations, Spinoza should say relative privation. And that shows actually that he agrees with Descartes about this, right? That so, what looks to me like privation. So remember, like the difference here is like the difference between ignorance and error. Ignorance means I just don't have the knowledge. Privation means I have something that I shouldn't have. Right? I have an erroneous opinion. Right? And Spinoza and Descartes are agreeing that this is a privation like only relative to a human mind. Referred to God, it's a mere negation, right? That is, from God's point of view, all we're saying is this finite mode is not the only finite mode. And that you can't know this one without all the others, which, who said you could, right? I mean, that's why God gave himself all these perfections. But referred to me, the fact that I don't have all these others means that, some ideas that are in my mind are not there clearly and distinctly. They're not there adequately, and therefore they're not there truly. So again, it's just because God didn't make me the infinite intellect, which is absurd, right? Like God couldn't have made me an individual, the infinite intellect. The infinite intellect is eternal. Just because God didn't make me the infinite intellect, therefore, from my point of view, there's both ignorance and error. Or at least the possibility of error. So that's one thing, but also that other answer, the second answer that Descartes gave, that perhaps I'm part of some whole that's more perfect because it contains an imperfect part. So again, in Spinoza, we can see that's not perhaps, that's exactly the situation, right? This whole is perfect. Meaning not it's really, really good, but it has all possible realities. It's so like this whole is perfect because it's not missing anything, including these imperfect finite modes. However, Spinoza does have something more to do. I mean, in a way, I already said what the answer is, but he has to work out the details, like to show exactly why this doesn't just make me ignorant, but also makes me go wrong. And along the way, he's also going to do what. So number one, that's what drives Descartes beyond that first answer about pure negation. But what drives Descartes beyond this one is something that Spinoza also has to do, which is to explain in what cases we do have reliable certain knowledge. So you need, again, you need it, at least to develop the details of this better to see what the answer to that is. Now, I mean, okay, I was going to talk about the will and the intellect being the same thing, but I think combined with combining what I said about that last time and what I said about it this time, mostly said, I guess I can see there's one thing I didn't mention about this. So so when Spinoza says that will and intellect are the same, and again, like what that means is that every one of these ideas in the divine intellect is not only, so to speak, a description of this mode, that's its object. And again, this relation is reference. It's not causation in either direction. That should be clear, but I don't know if I actually emphasized that, right? It can't be. There's no causation between modes of different attributes because they have nothing in common. That's, axiom, whatever. The cause and the effect have to have something in common. So this isn't causation, but it's this other weird representation object relation. Yeah.
Where do ideas of ideas fit in then? And if you have ideas of ideas, do they have like this corresponding mode of extension that they relate to, or is it just like self-referential underlying thought?
He talks about that in this reading, and he says that this idea regarded from another point of view is also the idea of itself. So there is another set of ideas of ideas. That part is, I find a little hard to explain, understand, but that is what he says. I think he says that the idea of this idea is this idea itself regarded formally rather than objectively. But I don't understand that either, because then there would be no reference. So but that's, anyway, that's what he says about it. I mean, and then he uses that, he uses that to basically show that, like, just as our ideas of bodies are inadequate, our ideas of our own ideas are also inadequate, because they're the same ideas. Right, what I was going to say is, so that, of course, rules out Descartes' main solution to the problem of error, which again is that I fall into error when I have the idea, but it's outside my intellect in the sense that I can't tell whether to affirm it or not using my reasoning. And Spinoza actually notes a problem about that. Like, shouldn't outside my intellect mean I just don't have the idea at all? What's this thing about having it but not? But anyway, so I have the idea, but I don't know whether to affirm or deny it. But I still have the power to affirm or deny it because the will is indivisible and infinite, right? So Spinoza is ruling that out. Spinoza says, our will is just as fine as our intellect. It's the same. So what is he going to say instead? What is a false idea? Right, because our problem here is to explain I understand on this basis why there are certain ideas I just don't have. They're not in my mind because they're not in the attribute of thought insofar as it's modified by my mind. That is, my mind isn't one of their causes. By the way, you should realize that, so since there's no causation either direction here, my mind has a cause, but the cause of my mind has to be another idea. Or ideas. Like how that works out exactly. Is it my parents' minds because it was my parents' bodies were the cause of my body, or something else? I don't know. Anyway, there's some other minds there's some other ideas, and every idea is a mind of something, and everything has a mind. Right? A lot of these things are going to carry over into Leibniz. Everything has a mind because if there's any body here, there's some idea whose object is that body. That's its mind. If the body is very simple, then its mind is very simple. The more composite the body is, the more complex its mind is. Okay, so, but anyway, the ideas that are in this mind. And here's a weird thing related to what I was just talking about. There's a general worry about the rationalist understanding of substance, accident, or this thing property versus cause effect. Like the ideas that are in the attribute of thought, insofar as it's modified by my mind, are those the effects of my mind, or are those the ideas in my mind? Or I guess you should say the ideas in my mind are effects of my mind. But in that case, it's definitely not my parents' minds that caused my mind. Because I'm not like idea in their mind. Maybe I am. I don't know. Anyway. Right. So leaving aside that weird question, right? This, this idea has certain consequences in the divine intellect. Those consequences are the ideas that are in my mind. To the extent that they're not consistent with each other, that's why I have one idea after another, not all together. And we're saying some of these ideas are false. So we want to know, first of all, what it means to say that they're false. Referred to the divine intellect, they're definitely true. So we want to know, what does it mean to say, refer to my intellect, they're false? And number two, we want to know how we can tell which ideas those are. So the basic answer to both of them is that a false idea is an inadequate idea. So false equals inadequate. And what does inadequate mean? Well, the term adequate was introduced in definition 4 at the beginning of part 2. By an adequate idea, I mean an idea which, insofar as it is considered in itself without relation to its object, has all the properties, that is, intrinsic characteristics of a true idea. So from that definition, you think what we're doing is this. We're saying, like, there's inadequate ideas and adequate ideas. Inadequate ideas are missing some of the intrinsic characteristics that an idea has to have in order to be true. Adequate ideas have all the intrinsic characteristics, so they're suitable to be true. But then they might not have the extrinsic characteristic of truth, which is agreement with their object. And that's actually exactly what Spinoza goes on to say there, right after definition 4. I have to find that page again. So on page 63. Right, after that definition, explication. I say intrinsic so as to exclude the extrinsic characteristic, to wit, the agreement of the idea with that of which it is an idea, the ideatum. Right, just like nature, he treats idea as if it were a Latin verb, as opposed to a Greek noun. They treat it as if we're a Latin verb that has a passive parts, ideatum, that which is idea. Yes.
I have a question. So is it correct then that, like if there are thoughts that are inadequate, that means they don't correspond to like extensions? So like even though they're both, like thought and extension are both infinite, is thought still kind of bigger than extension because there can be more thoughts? There are thoughts there that don't correspond to any extension.
It seems like it would have to be that, and that would be very hard to explain, right? What, I mean, first of all, it would contradict Proposition 7, which says the order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. But also, it would mean that God is deceived, right? That God has false ideas. So this is what, there's a double trickiness in here. Right, the first is, so, right, that is, we thought there were kind of like two prerequisites. I guess we thought there was like a hierarchy here. There's like true, adequate, and inadequate. And like, if this is the intrinsic qualifications to be a true idea, and this is the extrinsic one, agreeing with its object, then an inadequate idea doesn't have either of these. Right? It's lacking the intrinsic quality, and therefore it obviously can't agree with an object, because it's not suitable to agree with an object. Right? Like it's self-contradictory or something like that. An adequate idea has these, but not necessarily this. Whereas the true idea has both. Right? That's what we think is going on. So, but first of all, it turns out, as I just said, but then I'll tell you where Spinoza says it, that truth and adequacy are the same thing. Or at least that they coincide, that they're extensionally equivalent, as you might say. Well, this is part 4. I'm looking for part 2, Proposition 34. Okay, on page 86, every idea which in us is absolute, that is, adequate and perfect, is true. So all adequate ideas. I mean, you might think adequate and perfect mean two different things. I don't think. All the adequate ideas are true. But also, the proof of Proposition 34 works this way. When we say that there is in us an adequate and perfect idea, we are saying only this, the corollary to Proposition 11, that there is an adequate and perfect idea in God insofar as he constitutes the essence of our mind. Right? Proposition 11 of part 2, I think, is the one that says that, yeah, that which constitutes the actual being of the human mind is basically nothing else but the idea of an individual actually existing thing. Corollary, hence it follows that the human mind is part of the infinite intellect of God, right? So that's, he's saying, when we say that we have an adequate idea, we're saying that God has an adequate idea. Consequently, we are saying only this, that such an idea is true. Refers back to Proposition 32. All ideas are true insofar as they are referred to God, or related to God, it says here. And that refers back to the corollary of part 2, Proposition 7, right? That is, all ideas in God are true because the order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things, right? So, so this whole picture turns out to be a trick. Basically, there's only one kind of idea, and it's adequate and true. refer to the divine intellect. Refer to a finite intellect, it may be inadequate and therefore false. So like the question, how can I tell? The suspension of judgment that Descartes thinks I can carry out, first of all, is impossible because intellect and will are the same thing. So I don't have this ability to have an idea but not affirm it. I always affirm it. But number two, like the reason I was trying to do that is because I want to separate out what idea I have intrinsically, right? Like without knowing what its object is like. I want to see what the idea is like in me, and then I want to decide whether it's true or false. But Spinoza says there's no such thing. If the idea is inadequate in you, then it's false, and if it's adequate in you, then it's true. And all you have to do is figure out whether it's adequate or not. That is, whether it's even suitable to be true. Right? So it's as like it's as if the ideas that the meditator had to consider were all either the idea of God that shows that God exists, or self-contradictory ideas that couldn't possibly have an object. Like that's kind of the situation we're in, except its contradiction is not test. And moreover, this test doesn't really help us in the sense that when there aren't other ideas to help us out, we always just affirm whatever idea we have. And Spinoza says, think about when you're dreaming. You don't have the power to suspend judgment and not believe that those things that you see are there. At least in general, you don't. So, but in any case, we want to know, like, I think, again, as in Descartes, Descartes, in the end, I think, doesn't give you any way to, like, infallibly tell whether you're dreaming. To tell when you are dreaming, I should put it that way. Right? Because when you are dreaming, you're probably confused and you won't remember to apply the test. But Descartes does give you a way to tell when you're not dreaming. Because if you can see the connection of your current experience with the rest of your life and so on and so forth, then you can be certain that right now you're not dreaming. So that, like, there's something similar is true in Spinoza. Like, he's not going to give us a way to, we can't avoid being in error. But it is going to give us a way to isolate those parts of our thought that we can be certain are not errors. When I say give us away, I mean, of course, like you either will or you won't. This is going to be important in the rest of the book. It follows from the necessity of the divine essence what your mind is going to do. So, if Spinoza gives you advice, it's already determined in advance whether you're going to take it or not. If you are going to take it, then the fact that Spinoza gave it to you was part of the reason. It's not exactly pointless for him to say it, but it's kind of weird. All right, Leibniz is not going to, well, say that. Kant is really not going to like that. Leibniz, complicated. All right. Anyway, so but getting back to Spinoza, right. So what we need then is since all ideas in themselves, that is, as they occur in the infinite intellect, are adequate and true, we have to explain what it means that an idea is inadequate relative to our intellect. So, I mean, I kind of already said this in, oh my, are we out of time? I kind of already said this, and it's lucky because I don't have any more time. So I'll just say, like, the details of the second part of part two have to do with, first of all, showing that my idea of my own body is inadequate because it's in God's mind only insofar as he has other ideas that are not in my mind. And the ideas of, actually, that idea is not in my mind at all. The ideas of the modifications of my body in my mind are inadequate because although they depend on my mind, they also depend on the ideas of external bodies. Or the ideas of the parts of my body, which are not essential to it, right? Because the parts can change and my body is still the same body. And then finally, I guess I'm going to have to talk about this next, which is bad because there's too much reading for next time, but I can't completely skip over this. Spinoza explains why in the case of mathematics and metaphysics, we have ideas that because they depend on what's common to our body and all other bodies in one way or another, are adequately in our mind. And so those ideas are certainly true. Okay, but like I said, I'm out of time. Sorry about that. See you. What's today? See you Thursday. All right.